Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's video, I'm sharing 7 really scary true stories about old empty cabins in the Appalachian Mountains. These creepy stories will make you think twice before going into those old cabins alone. But before we start, please hit subscribe and don't forget to like and share this with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thanks so much. Now let's begin. I was 28, working as a health inspector for the West Virginia Department of Health when I got the call that changed everything. Looking back now, I should have known something was seriously wrong when my supervisor personally handed me the assignment instead of just putting it in the system like usual. He said hikers had been calling in complaints about some kind of rotting smell coming from an old cabin up in Copperhead Valley, and that there were reports of sick animals in the area. Standard stuff, really. Except for the way his hands shook slightly when he handed me the paperwork. I'd been doing inspections for about 3 years by then, mostly restaurants and hotels around Charleston, so I figured this would be a nice change of pace. Get out of the city for a day, drive up into the mountains, check out some old hunting cabin that probably had a dead deer underneath it or something. I packed my full testing kit, protective gear, camera, the works. State regulations, you know. I even brought my lunch because I figured I'd be up there most of the day. It was a Tuesday in late September, around 2 p.m. when I pulled up to the property. Beautiful day, actually. Sun was shining, temperature was perfect, leaves just starting to turn. The kind of day that makes you remember why people love West Virginia. I parked my state truck about 50 yards from the cabin and started walking up the dirt path, clipboard in hand, feeling pretty good about life. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't sit right. There were no sounds. I mean, none at all. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, nothing. And I'm talking about deep Appalachian woods in early fall. Those mountains should have been alive with noise. I stopped walking and just listened for maybe 30 seconds, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. The cabin itself looked solid enough from the outside. Old, sure, but not falling apart or anything. Single story, maybe built in the 60s or 70s with a small front porch and windows that still had glass in them. But as I got closer, I started noticing other weird things, like how all the plants in a perfect circle around the building were dying. Not just brown or wilted, but actually rotting away while still rooted in the ground. And there wasn't a single animal anywhere. No squirrels, no birds, not even any flies buzzing around. Then I caught the smell. I've inspected some pretty nasty places in my time. Restaurants with grease traps that hadn't been cleaned in months. Hotel rooms where people had died and weren't found for weeks. But this was different. It wasn't the smell of death, exactly. It was something alive, but wrong, like an infected wound mixed with spoiled milk, with this underlying sweetness that made your stomach turn. I actually had to stop and breathe through my mouth for a minute. I pulled on my protective gear, respirator, gloves, the whole setup, and approached the front door. I had legal authority to enter the property for health code inspection, so I documented everything with photos and knocked first, just to be polite. No answer, of course. The door was unlocked. The second I stepped inside, I knew I was in trouble. The floor was covered in this thick, sticky substance that looked like tree sap, but moved slightly when I stepped on it. Not like it was alive exactly, but like there was something underneath it, breathing slowly. The walls were coated in the same material, this flesh-colored coating that seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. I thought maybe it was just my imagination at first, you know, the bad smell getting to me despite the respirator. But when I held my hand up close to the wall, I could feel warmth coming off it. I started taking samples immediately. That's what I was there for, after all. But every reading on my air quality meter was coming back with numbers I'd never seen before. Toxic levels of compounds that my equipment couldn't even identify. The temperature inside was at least 20 degrees warmer than outside, and it wasn't coming from any heating system I could see. That's when I noticed the veins. I'm not talking metaphorically here. There were actual veins running through the ceiling, carrying some kind of dark fluid from room to room. They pulsed regularly, like they were pumping something through the entire structure. And in the corners, there were these egg-like sacs, about the size of basketballs, some of them cracked open with whatever had been inside long gone. I found the remains of animals throughout the house, or what was left of them. They were partially dissolved, absorbed into the floor material like it was digesting them. A raccoon here, part of a deer there, all of them in various stages of being broken down by whatever this organic matter was. The worst part was when I realized the entire cabin was breathing. I'm serious. The whole structure expanded and contracted slowly, like I was standing inside something's lungs. The walls would push out slightly, then pull back in, over and over in this steady rhythm. And every time it happened, that sweet, rotting smell got stronger. I was trying to collect more samples when the floor started responding to my movements. Tendrils, thin, flesh-colored things about as thick as garden hoses, began emerging from the organic matter, reaching toward my boots. When I stepped back, they followed. When I moved left, they adjusted course. This stuff wasn't just alive, it was actively hunting. That's when I heard the voices. At first, I thought someone else was in the cabin. Human voices calling for help, asking someone to please let them go. But they were coming from inside the walls themselves, muffled like people trapped behind soundproofing. I pressed my ear to one of the pulsing sections and could hear multiple voices overlapping, men and women, all of them begging for someone to help them. The voices knew my name. "Please, James," one of them said, clear as day. "Don't leave us here like this. We can't die, we can't escape, we just keep getting digested over and over." I stumbled backward, nearly falling into one of those tendrils, which immediately tried to wrap around my ankle. The respirator wasn't helping anymore. I was breathing hard, panicking, and I could taste that sweet rot even through the filter. The walls were contracting faster now, and the temperature was climbing. Whatever this thing was, my presence had excited it. I made it to the basement door. Hadn't even known there was a basement until I nearly fell down the stairs trying to get away from those grasping tendrils. What I found down there still gives me nightmares 15 years later. The entire basement had been converted into one massive organism. The brain, if you want to call it that, was the size of a small car, pulsing and wet with dozens of human faces embedded in its surface. Some of them were still moving, still aware, eyes tracking my movements as I stumbled down the stairs. Arms and legs stuck out at odd angles, some of them still wearing clothes, all of them partially absorbed, but somehow still alive. It spoke to me using all their voices at once. "We've been waiting for someone with authority," it said, the words coming from maybe 6 different mouths simultaneously. "Someone who could bring others. You're going to help us spread." That's when I learned what I was really dealing with. This thing explained, in perfect English using the voices of its victims, that it wasn't from Earth. It had crashed somewhere in these mountains decades ago and had been adapting, learning, using local biological material to build these breeding chambers. The cabin wasn't just infected, it had been completely converted into a reproductive facility, and it was just one of many. The thing told me about other sites throughout Appalachia, other abandoned buildings it had claimed and transformed. It was spreading slowly, methodically, using hikers and hunters as raw material while it prepared for large-scale reproduction. Each cabin was supposed to eventually produce hundreds of offspring that would spread throughout the mountain range. The tendrils from upstairs were working their way down toward me while it talked, getting bolder, reaching for my protective gear. When they touched my equipment, they tried to dissolve it, incorporate it into the organic mass. I watched my sample containers melt and get absorbed in seconds. I ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. Up those basement stairs, through the breathing cabin, dodging tendrils and trying not to slip on that digestive slime covering everything. The organism was producing some kind of knockout gas by then. I could see it hissing out of pores in the walls. And my vision was starting to blur even through the respirator. I made it to my truck and called in a biological hazard emergency immediately. Within 6 hours, there were CDC vehicles swarming the valley. By the next morning, the entire area was under federal quarantine. I spent 3 weeks in isolation being tested for contamination. Clean bill of health, somehow. But I had to sign more non-disclosure agreements than I could count. They transferred me to a desk job in Huntington, told me the cabin had been sterilized and that I should never discuss what I'd seen with anyone. But I still get reports, classified updates, delivered to my house every few months, about similar discoveries throughout the region. Abandoned mines converted into breeding chambers, old farmhouses where the family disappeared and something else moved in. Each report includes a map with more red dots than the last one, marking sites that have been found and contained. The thing is, I don't think we're winning. Last month's report had 43 marked locations across 3 states. That's up from 37 the month before. And those are just the ones we know about. I never went back to field work. These days I process restaurant licenses from an office building in town, and I sleep with a loaded shotgun next to my bed. Not that a shotgun would help against something like that, but it makes me feel better. Sometimes I wonder about those voices I heard, begging for help. Whether they're still down there, still aware, still being slowly digested and reformed into something else. Whether the people in the other locations are experiencing the same thing. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains on vacation or visiting family, I'll catch a whiff of that sweet, rotting smell on the wind, and I'll know that somewhere nearby, another old cabin or mine shaft has been claimed. I don't stop to investigate anymore. I just drive faster and try not to think about how many more breeding grounds might be out there, waiting for the right conditions to start producing whatever it is they're designed to create. Looking back now, I think that's why my supervisor was shaking when he handed me that assignment. He'd probably been getting those classified reports too, knowing that every inspection might be the one that didn't come back. I still work for the state, but I've never taken another field assignment, and I never will. Some things are better left alone in the mountains, even if it means they keep spreading. Back when I was 26, I thought I had my whole life figured out. I was working as a junior geologist for the University of Tennessee, fresh out of grad school with a shiny new degree and more ambition than sense. My girlfriend Sarah used to joke that I'd rather spend time with rocks than people, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. There's something peaceful about geology. Rocks don't lie. They don't have hidden agendas, and they've got stories that go back millions of years if you know how to read them. That's why I jumped at the chance when Dr. Martinez asked if I wanted to join a research team heading up to Devil's Backbone Ridge in the eastern part of the state. We'd been getting some weird seismic readings from that area. Nothing major, not earthquake stuff, but these strange little vibrations that didn't match any known geological patterns. The university wanted a team to go up there for 2 weeks, set up some equipment, and figure out what was causing it. I figured it would be good experience, maybe even lead to something I could write a paper about. The team was small, just 4 of us. There was me handling the geological survey work, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in biology, Marcus Webb doing atmospheric readings, and Janet Rodriguez from the archaeology department. The plan was pretty straightforward. We'd use this old abandoned cabin near the ridge as our base camp, spread out our equipment across a 2-mile radius, and document everything we found. I remember driving up there on a Monday morning in late October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the mountains looked like something out of a postcard. Marcus was riding with me in my pickup, and we were both excited. This was the kind of field work you dream about in graduate school. Real research, real mysteries to solve, and 2 weeks away from lecture halls and lab reports. The cabin itself was pretty basic. 2 bedrooms, a main room, and a kitchen that barely worked. Some hunting club had used it years ago, then just abandoned it when they couldn't keep up with the maintenance. The university had gotten permission from the landowner to use it, and it was perfect for our needs. Isolated enough that we wouldn't get interference from traffic or machinery, but close enough to civilization that we could get supplies if we needed them. We spent the first couple days just setting up our equipment and getting baseline readings. I had seismic monitors, ground-penetrating radar, and core sampling tools. Basically everything you'd need for a comprehensive geological survey. The others had their own gear for their specialties. Everything seemed normal at first. The readings we were getting matched what we expected for that type of terrain. But by Thursday, things started getting weird. The seismic activity we'd come to study was definitely there, but it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Normal seismic activity has patterns. You can trace it back to fault lines or underground water movement or settling bedrock. This was different. The vibrations seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and they followed no pattern I could identify. It was like the mountain was breathing. The ground-penetrating radar showed something even stranger. There was a massive hollow space underneath us. And I mean massive. Not a cave or cavern system, but a single enormous empty space that seemed to stretch under the entire ridge. When I ran the calculations, the numbers didn't make sense. According to my readings, this hollow space was larger than the mountain itself, which was physically impossible. Marcus was getting equally strange readings from his atmospheric equipment. The air pressure would fluctuate randomly, sometimes dropping so low it made your ears pop, then spiking back up to normal. Temperature readings were all over the map too. Cold spots that had no explanation. Areas where the air felt thick and humid when it should have been dry mountain air. Janet found some old survey records at the county courthouse that made things even more interesting. The Cherokee had specific warnings about this ridge, dating back to the 1800s. They called it a place where the earth was sick and warned against staying there overnight. Even after they were forced out, some of the early settlers reported strange occurrences: livestock going missing, people getting disoriented and lost for days, unexplained illnesses. By the end of the first week, Dr. Chen was finding biological anomalies too. There were no insects anywhere near our equipment sites. No birds, no small mammals, nothing. The trees looked healthy, but when she took samples, the cellular structure was wrong somehow, like they were growing in response to conditions that shouldn't exist. What really got to me, though, was how my equipment kept malfunctioning. Not breaking down exactly, but giving readings that contradicted basic physics. I had a magnetic compass that would spin randomly, sometimes pointing in directions that made no geometric sense. Water levels in my measuring instruments would show liquid flowing uphill. Gravity readings suggested that objects should fall sideways in certain areas around the cabin. I kept recalibrating everything, thinking there had to be a logical explanation. Bad equipment, electromagnetic interference from some source I hadn't identified. Anything that would make sense. But every test I ran confirmed what I was seeing. The laws of physics worked differently here. By the second week, none of us were sleeping well. The cabin felt wrong at night, like something was watching us from the darkness outside. We'd hear sounds that had no source. Footsteps on the roof, voices calling our names from the woods, mechanical humming that seemed to come from underground. Our cell phones worked fine until we got within a quarter mile of our equipment sites. Then they'd just go dead. Not low battery, not no signal. Completely dead, like they'd been turned off by some external force. It was Tuesday of the second week when we made contact. I was down at the main seismic station, about half a mile from the cabin, trying to figure out why all my readings had suddenly doubled in intensity overnight. The ground under my feet was actually vibrating now, not just registering on the instruments. I was checking connections when the seismic monitor started displaying something I'd never seen before. Mathematical equations, complex geometric patterns, scrolling across my screen like someone was typing them in real time. At first I thought it was some kind of equipment malfunction, maybe a computer virus or corrupted data. But the equations were sophisticated. Orbital mechanics, quantum field theory, calculations that were way beyond anything our equipment should have been capable of displaying. And they were responding to me. When I touched the keyboard, the patterns would change, like whatever was sending them was aware I was there. I called the others down, and we spent hours trying to understand what we were seeing. Marcus recognized some of the atmospheric equations. They described weather patterns on a planetary scale, but for atmospheric conditions that didn't exist on Earth. Janet identified what looked like archaeological dating calculations, but for time periods that stretched back millions of years before human civilization. Dr. Chen went pale when she saw the biological data streaming across my screen. Genetic sequences, evolutionary charts, classification systems for species that had never existed on our planet, and all of it was being transmitted from somewhere directly beneath us. That's when we realized we weren't just studying geological anomalies. Something down there was studying us back. The comms. Communication attempts got more sophisticated over the next 2 days. The entity, I don't know what else to call it, started using our own equipment to send messages. It would manipulate our readings to create patterns, use our radios to generate specific frequencies, even cause our instruments to display three-dimensional models that showed Earth's position relative to other star systems. What it was telling us was impossible to fully comprehend, but the basic message was clear. We were insignificant. Earth was one of thousands of worlds being monitored by something vast and ancient, a civilization that spanned galaxies and had been watching primitive species develop for millions of years. The mountain we were studying wasn't a natural formation. It was a monitoring station, one of countless others scattered across the universe. To this thing, humans were barely worth cataloging. We were a recent development, an accidental species that had appeared just moments ago in cosmic time. Our entire history, everything we'd built and achieved, was like watching bacteria multiply in a petri dish. Interesting from a scientific standpoint, but ultimately meaningless. Dr. Chen was the first to crack. The biological data the entity shared showed the evolutionary path it expected humanity to follow. A brief flowering of technological development followed by inevitable extinction within the next few thousand years. She started having panic attacks, then stopped eating, then began talking about how pointless everything was. By Thursday, we had to physically restrain her from walking into the woods and just disappearing. Marcus lasted a day longer before the atmospheric data broke him. The entity showed him weather patterns from across the galaxy, climate systems on worlds where intelligent life had developed and died out millions of times over. He became obsessed with the idea that our planet was just a temporary accident, that everything we cared about would be forgotten long before our sun burned out. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking, just sat staring at his insomnios. Truths like they might show him a future where humanity mattered. Janet found records the entity shared about previous civilizations on Earth, species that had developed intelligence and technology millions of years before humans evolved, then vanished without leaving any trace we could recognize. We weren't even the first intelligent life on our own planet, just the current temporary experiment. She started crying and couldn't stop, kept saying that nothing we'd ever discovered or learned was new, that we were just repeating patterns that had played out countless times before. By Friday, I was the only one still functional, and barely. The knowledge the entity had shared was like a weight pressing down on my mind, making it impossible to care about anything human scale. My relationship with Sarah, my career, my family. It all felt like children playing dress-up while the adults were busy with real work somewhere else in the universe. That's when it made me an offer. The entity could sense that I was the most stable of the group, the one least likely to completely break down under the weight of cosmic knowledge. It offered me a position as Earth's permanent observer, a role that would involve monitoring human development until our inevitable extinction and filing reports with the Galactic Monitoring System. I would be given extended life, protection from the psychological damage that cosmic knowledge usually caused, and access to information systems that spanned thousands of civilizations. All I had to do was give up my humanity. I could feel it in my head as it made the offer, this vast intelligence that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive, that could manipulate reality the way I might move pieces on a chessboard. It showed me glimpses of its true form, geometry that my eyes couldn't process, structures that folded space and time around themselves, a presence so large that galaxies were just reference points it used for navigation. It was beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman, and it was offering me a chance to become something like it. I said no. I don't know why. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was some deep human instinct to hold on to what I was even when it seemed meaningless. But I refused the offer, told it I'd rather stay human and die with the rest of my species than become something else and watch from the outside as everything I'd ever cared about disappeared. The entity was disappointed, I think, not angry. just disappointed, the way you might be if an interesting insect refused to cooperate with your experiment. It erased most of the cosmic knowledge from our minds, not out of kindness, but because humans who knew too much about the universe's true nature tended to break down completely, and broken observers weren't useful. We packed up our equipment Saturday morning and drove back to the university. None of us talked about what had happened. Our official report listed equipment malfunctions and inconclusive data. The university was disappointed but not surprised. Sometimes research projects just don't work out. Dr. Chen transferred to a different department and stopped doing fieldwork. Marcus left academia entirely and became a weather forecaster for a local TV station. Janet took early retirement and moved to Florida. We never talked about Devil's Backbone Ridge, never acknowledged what we'd experienced up there. I tried to go back to normal life, but it didn't work. The partial memories the entity had left me with were like a constant background noise, a reminder that everything I did was cosmically irrelevant. My relationship with Sarah fell apart within 6 months. I couldn't maintain friendships, couldn't get excited about my research, couldn't shake the feeling that I was just playing out a script in some vast experiment. I left the university 2 years later and became a high school earth science teacher. It seemed more honest somehow, teaching basic facts about rocks and weather patterns to kids who didn't need to know how meaningless it all was in the larger context. I'm 34 now, married to a woman who thinks I'm just naturally quiet and introspective. She doesn't know about the mountain, doesn't know that sometimes I wake up at night with fragments of cosmic mathematics running through my head. I still get the dreams sometimes. Visions of monitoring stations on other worlds. Reports filed about species that developed and died out while Earth was still cooling from its formation. I know it's still up there, still watching, still collecting data about our temporary civilization. And I know that someday, probably sooner than we think, it'll file its final report about humanity and move on to monitoring whatever develops next. The mountain will remain long after we're gone, patient and eternal, feeding its endless appetite for knowledge about the brief, bright flames of intelligence that flicker and die throughout the universe. I've never gone back to Devil's Backbone Ridge. I never will. But sometimes, when I'm teaching my students about geological time and the age of mountains, I catch myself looking toward the eastern part of the state and wondering if it remembers me too. Back when I was 31, I was working on my graduate degree in Appalachian history. My professor, Dr. Martinez, had this obsession with finding primary source material that nobody else had touched. One Thursday morning in October, he called me into his office and handed me a folder thick with old survey maps and county records. "There's a cabin," he said, "built in 1847 up in Whiskey Branch Hollow, Kentucky. Family named the Calhouns. Place has been sitting empty since before the Civil War, and somehow it's still standing." He wanted me to spend 3 days there, documenting everything for my dissertation on pre-war mountain settlements. Perfect lighting, he said, professional opportunity, the kind of find that could make my academic career. I packed my camera, measuring tools, and documentation supplies like I was heading to any other archaeological site. Treated it like serious work, because that's what it was. I'd reserved a room at some little motel about 20 miles from the site. Figured I'd drive up each morning and work until the light got bad. The whole thing felt routine, professional. I'd done dozens of similar documentation projects across eastern Kentucky, and this was just another day at the office. The drive up to Whiskey Branch Hollow took me through some beautiful country, rolling hills covered in oak and maple just starting to turn colors. I found the dirt road that led to the cabin without too much trouble, though my GPS started acting weird about 2 miles from the site. Kept telling me to turn around, like it couldn't figure out where I was going. I just switched it off and followed the hand-drawn map Dr. Martinez had given me. I reached the site right at 9 a.m., just like I'd planned. The cabin sat in this little clearing, surrounded by trees that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. And the professor was right. The place was remarkably well-preserved. Most cabins from that era, you're lucky if you find a foundation and maybe one wall still standing. But this one looked like the family had just stepped out to check on the livestock and never came back. The door was solid oak, still on its hinges. Windows had real glass, not just shutters. Even the chimney was intact. I walked around the outside first, taking photographs and measurements, making notes about the construction techniques and materials. Everything matched what I'd expect from an 1847 mountain homestead. Hand-hewn logs, mortise and tenon joints, cedar shake roof that somehow hadn't rotted through. It was like finding a perfect time capsule. When I finally went inside, that's when I started to feel like something was off. The interior was pristine. I mean, unnaturally pristine. There was furniture, a table, chairs, a bed in the back room, shelves lined with pottery and tools, clothes hanging on pegs by the door, personal items scattered around like someone had been living there yesterday. After 170-plus years, there should have been decay, dust, weather damage from broken windows, but everything looked fresh, clean, ready for use. I started documenting systematically, room by room, photographed every piece of furniture, every tool, every scrap of clothing, made detailed measurements and sketches, took notes about construction techniques and material choices. This was exactly the kind of primary source material Dr. Martinez had been hoping for. Untouched history right there in front of me. But that's when the weird stuff started happening. First thing I noticed was my watch. It just stopped working at exactly 3:17 p.m. Just stopped. I tapped it, wound it. Nothing. Figured the battery had died, even though I'd just replaced it the week before. But then I looked at my phone, and it showed a completely different time. And there was this old pendulum clock hanging on the cabin wall, still ticking away, showing yet another time entirely. None of them matched, and when I looked at the sun's position through the windows, it didn't match any of them. The sunlight itself was behaving strangely. I'm not talking about normal shadows moving as the day progressed. The shadows were moving backward. I watched a shadow from the window frame creep across the floor in the wrong direction, like the sun was moving east to west instead of west to east. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just watching, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I checked my camera's display to review the photos I'd taken, and that's when I really started to panic. The timestamps showed I'd taken pictures at 11:30 a.m., 12:45 p.m., even 1:15 p.m. But it was only just past noon by my best guess, and I'd only been inside the cabin for maybe an hour. The camera was showing photos I hadn't taken yet, of angles and rooms I hadn't even entered. I tried to stay logical about it, figured there was some kind of electromagnetic interference, maybe from mineral deposits in the ground. Old mining country can do weird things to electronics, but when I looked down at my hands, I noticed my fingernails were longer than they'd been that morning, not by much, but enough that I could see the difference. And when I ran my hand through my hair, it felt thicker, like it had grown during the day. The documentation I'd been so carefully writing started changing while I wasn't looking. I'd write October 15th, 2024 at the top of a page, turn away to take a photograph, and when I looked back, the date had shifted to October 15th, 1847. My handwriting, same ink, but the date was different. I must have stared at that page for 5 minutes trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. I started remembering conversations I'd never had. Someone asking me about the harvest, about whether the corn would last through winter. A woman's voice, worried about her husband coming back from town. Children laughing somewhere outside, even though I was alone. The memories felt real, like I'd actually participated in these conversations, but I knew they'd never happened. Items in my backpack started looking different. My digital voice recorder looked like an old music box. My GPS unit resembled some kind of primitive compass. They'd function normally for a few minutes, then transform back into something that belonged in 1847, then switch back again. It was like reality couldn't decide which century it wanted to be. And then I started experiencing the same hour over and over again. I'd check my phone, see 2:30, spend what felt like a full hour documenting and photographing, check my phone again, and it would still show 2:30. But each time the hour repeated, small things were different. A chair moved to a different spot, different clothes on the pegs, different items on the shelves. Like I was seeing variations of the same moment, played out slightly differently each time. That's when I started seeing them. Translucent figures moving through the cabin like they owned the place. A man in work clothes, checking the fireplace, adding wood to a fire I couldn't feel. A woman in a long dress, preparing food on the table, humming quietly to herself. Two children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, playing some game with wooden blocks on the floor. They were see-through, like looking at old film projected on smoke, but they cast shadows and moved objects around. At first, they didn't seem to notice me. They went about their daily routines like I wasn't there. But gradually, over what felt like hours but might have been minutes or days, they started acknowledging my presence. The man nodded when he passed me. The woman smiled and said good morning. The children waved, and I found myself responding, naturally, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The family started treating me like I belonged there, like I was some distant relative who'd come to visit and decided to stay a while. The man, who I somehow knew was named Daniel, asked me about my work, about whether I thought the cabin would hold up through another winter. The woman, Sarah, offered me food and worried when I didn't eat enough. The children, Emma and Thomas, showed me their toys and asked me to tell them stories. I found myself speaking differently around them. Not consciously, but my vocabulary changed, my accent shifted. I started using words and phrases that felt natural but weren't part of my normal speech. Reckon instead of think. Mighty instead of very. It felt like putting on an old coat that fit perfectly. My modern clothes started looking different too. My jeans became rough work pants. My t-shirt turned into a cotton shirt with buttons. My hiking boots looked like leather work boots that had been worn for years. When I looked in the old mirror hanging by the door, I looked like I belonged in 1847. And the strangest part was, I started to feel like I did belong there. I knew things I'd never learned. How to split firewood properly, how to preserve meat for winter, which plants were good for medicine and which ones would kill you. Family history going back generations. Stories about Daniel's grandfather fighting in the Revolutionary War, about Sarah's mother dying in the cholera outbreak of 1833. I developed genuine feelings for these people. When Daniel worried about having enough firewood for winter, I worried with him. When Sarah mentioned that Emma had been coughing, I felt the same parental concern they did. When Thomas asked me to help him with his reading, I felt proud when he sounded out a difficult word. My memories of 2024 started feeling distant and unimportant. My graduate program, my apartment, my modern life. It all seemed like a dream I'd had once. This cabin, this family, their daily struggles and small joys felt completely real and immediate. Every time I thought about leaving, something would happen that required my help. Daniel would injure his hand chopping wood and need someone to finish the job. Sarah would get sick and need someone to watch the children. Emma would have nightmares and only seem to calm down when I was there to comfort her. It felt like the family needed me, like I'd become essential to their survival. And when I tried to talk about the outside world, about needing to get back to my research, they looked at me with such confusion and concern that I felt guilty for bringing it up. They'd worry that I was getting sick, that the isolation was affecting my mind. "There's no rush," Sarah would say gently. "You're family now. This is where you belong." I stopped trying to leave, stopped thinking about my modern life, started responding to the name they called me, Thomas, after Daniel's brother who'd died young. I felt loved and needed in a way I'd never experienced in my real life. This family depended on me, and I depended on them. That's when I met the thing that had been orchestrating all of this. I was out behind the cabin one evening, splitting wood for the morning fire, when I noticed someone watching me from the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, someone from another homestead deeper in the mountains, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized this figure was wrong in fundamental ways. It looked almost human, but its proportions were slightly off. Arms too long, torso too narrow, head tilted at an angle that should have been uncomfortable. It moved closer, and I could see its skin had a waxy, artificial quality, like it was wearing a mask made of flesh. "You've adapted well," it said, and its voice sounded like an echo of my own voice, but delayed by a fraction of a second. Better than most. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt oddly calm, like I'd been expecting this conversation. "You're not from 1847, I said. It wasn't a question. Neither are you, it replied. But you could be, permanently. It explained that it was something like a shepherd, tasked with maintaining temporal stability. The cabin was one of several anchor points it protected, places where time moved differently, where the past could be preserved and protected from disruption. I collect people like you, it said, people who threaten the timeline through research, through investigation, through too much curiosity about things that should remain undisturbed. I offer them a choice, a perfect life in the time period of their choosing, or a return to their original timeline with certain adjustments. The adjustments, it explained, would ensure I never returned to this kind of research, never again posed a threat to temporal stability. I'd lose my passion for history, my curiosity about the past. I'd find a different career, live a normal life, never think about time anomalies or unexplained phenomena. Or, it continued, you can stay. Become a permanent member of the Calhoun family. They're real in their way. This moment, this day, this life, I preserve it, protect it, keep it safe from the ravages of linear time. You can have love, belonging, purpose, everything your modern life lacks. I looked back at the cabin, where warm light spilled from the windows and I could hear Sarah calling the children in for supper. I could smell the wood smoke, the cooking food, the familiar sense of a life I'd grown to love. Daniel waved at me from the doorway, asking if I was coming in to eat. For a moment, I seriously considered staying. This life felt more real, more meaningful than anything I'd ever experienced. These people cared about me in a way that no one in 2024 ever had. I had a place here, a role, a family that needed me. But something deep inside me recoiled at the idea of erasing my real existence, of becoming a different person entirely, even if that person was happier. The Thomas who belonged to this family wasn't me. He was someone the entity had created, someone designed to fit perfectly into this preserved moment. I want to go back, I said. The thing nodded like it had expected this answer. Most do, eventually. They realize they're becoming someone else and it frightens them. Reality shattered around me like glass. I found myself standing outside the cabin in broad daylight, my phone showing the correct date and time. The cabin looked different now. Older, more weathered, with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, I could see decay and neglect, the natural result of 170 years of abandonment. All my documentation was gone. The photographs on my camera showed nothing but error messages. My notes were blank pages. My equipment bag contained only normal, modern items that looked like they'd never been used. I drove back to the motel in a daze, trying to process what had happened. Had I imagined the entire experience? Had I suffered some kind of breakdown, hallucinated the whole thing? There was no evidence, no proof that any of it had been real. I never completed my dissertation. Couldn't bring myself to continue with historical research after that. Every time I tried to focus on the past, I'd remember the warmth of that cabin, the love of that family, the choice I'd made to abandon them. I changed my major to computer science, graduated 2 years late, and now I work in IT for a small company in Lexington. I don't talk about history anymore, don't visit historical sites or read about the past. I've structured my entire life around staying firmly planted in the present moment. But sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about the Calhoun family. Are they still there, in their preserved moment, waiting for someone to join them? Does the entity still watch over them, protecting their little piece of forever from the march of time? And if I'm being completely honest, there are nights when I think about driving back to Whiskey Branch Hole, low. When my apartment feels too empty, when my job feels meaningless, when I wonder if I made the right choice, but I never do. Because I know that if I went back, I might not have the strength to leave again. And I'm not sure the person I am now would survive becoming someone else, even someone happier. Some doors, once you close them, should stay closed forever. Back when I was 29, I was working in corporate marketing for this tech startup in Richmond. The company was one of those places that acted like they were changing the world, but really we just made apps for ordering food. I'd been there about 2 years when HR announced we were all going on a mandatory team-building retreat. They called it an executive development weekend, which should have been my first red flag since none of us were executives. The destination was Raven's Nest Gap, Virginia, some restored cabin complex up in the mountains that specialized in corporate retreats. Our boss made it clear this wasn't optional. 5 of us from the marketing department got assigned to go together. Me, Sarah from social media, Mike, who did graphic design, Lisa from content, and James, who handled client relations. Honestly, we barely knew each other beyond work stuff. We'd grab lunch sometimes or talk by the coffee machine, but that was about it. The company booked us this expensive package deal: 3 days and 2 nights of trust exercises, problem-solving games, and what they called synergy development. They sent us up in the company van on a Friday afternoon, and the whole ride felt like we were heading to detention. None of us wanted to be there, but we all needed our jobs, so we went through the motions. The cabin was nice enough, I'll give them that. Modern amenities, good Wi-Fi, comfortable beds. It looked like they'd spent real money fixing up some old mountain lodge for business groups. When we arrived, this professional facilitator met us, some woman named Dr. Patricia, who had all these credentials in organizational psychology. She ran us through the weekend schedule, and it was packed. Trust falls, group problem-solving challenges, personality assessments, team-building games. The kind of stuff that makes your skin crawl, but you do it anyway because work is what we're... What struck me as odd right away was how many cameras they had set up everywhere. Dr. Patricia explained they recorded everything for progress evaluation and to help companies see how their teams developed. Made sense, I guess, but it felt weird having every conversation monitored. The first night was awkward as hell. We did these icebreaker exercises where you had to share personal stories and talk about your goals. Sarah mentioned she was going through a divorce. Mike talked about his anxiety issues. I found myself telling them about my dad's drinking problem, which I'd never discussed at work before. Dr. Patricia took notes on everything, nodding and asking follow-up questions. She said sharing personal information built trust and improved workplace relationships. The personality tests started Saturday morning. Not just simple questionnaires, but detailed psychological assessments that went on for hours. They measured everything: risk tolerance, leadership potential, susceptibility to peer pressure, response to authority. Dr. Patricia said understanding our psychological profiles would help us work together better. Between the tests, we did these group exercises where we earned points for cooperation and lost them for not participating enthusiastically enough. That's when things started feeling really off. If one person didn't fully engage with an activity, the whole group got penalized. Lost privileges like free time or dessert after dinner. It created this pressure where we all had to police each other's behavior. Mike mentioned feeling uncomfortable with some of the personal questions, and suddenly we all lost our evening break. Sarah complained about the cameras, and they moved dinner back an hour as punishment for negative team dynamics. By Saturday night, I noticed we weren't allowed any private spaces. Even the bathrooms had cameras, supposedly faux or safety reasons. Our phones got confiscated for the digital detox experience. They said our families had been notified we'd be out of contact for the weekend. All our meals came from the retreat kitchen, and we ate together in the main dining room under supervision. Dr. Patricia explained this created dependency and forced us to rely on each other for social interaction. The weird part was how my coworkers started changing. Sarah, who'd been quiet and reserved at work, became aggressive and confrontational during the group exercises. Mike started obsessively following every rule and reporting when others didn't comply fully. Lisa developed this creepy devotion to Dr. Patricia, hanging on every word and volunteering for extra activities. James became paranoid, constantly looking around and whispering about being watched. Sunday morning brought more intensive psychological sessions. Dr. Patricia met with each of us individually for what she called personal development counseling. She knew details about our lives that weren't in any company files: my relationship history, my mother's mental health issues, my college struggles with depression. When I asked how she knew these things, she said the personality tests revealed more than people realized. She used this information to push emotional buttons, making me question my memories and relationships. The group dynamics exercises got darker too. They made us compete against each other for basic privileges like bathroom breaks or water. We had to betray confidences shared earlier to prove our loyalty to the company. Anyone who resisted or questioned the activities got labeled as having authority issues or team dysfunction problems. They'd single you out for extra psychological evaluation and individual correction sessions. By Sunday afternoon, I realized my coworkers had become completely different people. Lisa was actively spying on the rest of us, reporting private conversations to Dr. Patricia. Mike had developed this robotic compliance where he'd follow any instruction without question. Sarah didn't remember conversations we'd had just the day before, insisting they never happened. James believed Dr. Patricia was some kind of genius who understood human nature better than we understood ourselves. That's when I started paying attention to details I'd missed before. The cameras weren't just recording. They had speakers too, playing subliminal audio we couldn't consciously hear. Our meals tasted off, kind of metallic and bitter. The room temperature kept changing to make us uncomfortable and disoriented. The schedule was designed to prevent adequate sleep, keeping us exhausted and mentally vulnerable. I found out the truth by accident Sunday evening. I was looking for a bathroom and took a wrong turn, ending up in a basement area that was supposed to be off-limits. Down there, I found files on dozens of other corporate groups who'd done this same retreat. Photos, psychological profiles, before and after behavioral assessments. There were rooms set up like prison cells, and I could hear people talking quietly behind locked doors. One of the doors was unlocked. Inside, I found 3 people from a previous retreat who'd been there for weeks. They told me the whole thing was a government research program testing behavior modification techniques on corporate employees. They chose participants based on specific psychological profiles and family situations, people who wouldn't be missed immediately, or who didn't have strong support networks. The retreat was just the beginning. People who responded well to the conditioning got released back to their jobs as test subjects for workplace manipulation techniques. People who resisted too much disappeared permanently. The company we worked for was a front operation, and our real job was being human lab rats for psychological control experiments. I managed to record some of this on a device I'd hidden in my personal items before they confiscated our phones, got enough evidence to contact the FBI when I finally escaped. It took coordination with the other hidden participants and some luck, but we managed to get out during a shift change Sunday night. The authorities shut down the operation and arrested Dr. Patricia along with several government contractors and company executives. Turned out they'd been running illegal human experimentation programs at multiple corporate retreat sites across the country. The whole thing made national news for about a week before getting buried under other stories. Most of my coworkers from that weekend never fully recovered. The behavior modification techniques they used caused permanent psychological damage. Sarah ended up in long-term psychiatric care. Mike developed severe anxiety and can't hold down a job. Lisa still believes the retreat was beneficial and refuses to accept it was illegal experimentation. James disappeared entirely. His family hasn't heard from him since. I'm living under witness protection now because of threats from people connected to the program who didn't get arrested. Had to change my name, move across the country, start over completely. I still have nightmares about those cameras and Dr. Patricia's voice. Can't handle job interviews or performance evaluations without having panic attacks. The worst part is knowing how many other people went through this. How many corporate retreats and team-building programs are actually psychological experiments? How many missing persons cases are really people who resisted the conditioning and got disappeared? I don't trust any workplace that talks about team building or employee development anymore. To this day, I won't attend any company events or participate in group activities. I work freelance now, from home, with minimal human contact. It's lonely, but it's safe. I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous predators wear business suits and carry psychology degrees. They don't need to drag you into the woods to destroy your life. They'll do it in a conference room with your full cooperation. Back when I was 27, I was working as a cybersecurity specialist for a tech firm in Charlotte. I'd been doing network security for about 3 years, mostly dealing with corporate hackers and data breaches. Nothing too exciting, just sitting behind a computer all day tracking IP addresses and building firewalls. My boss called me into his office on a Friday afternoon and told me about this weird case we'd picked up. Some company was losing millions to these sophisticated cyber attacks, and all the data trails led back to this one location in the mountains of North Carolina, Laurel Creek Hollow, up near the Tennessee border. The thing was, the attacks were coming from what looked like an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. No power lines, no internet infrastructure, nothing that should have been able to run the kind of operation they were seeing. My job was simple: drive up there on Saturday morning, document whatever illegal server farm they had set up, gather evidence for the FBI, and get out. I packed my laptop, signal analyzers, network scanning tools, basically my whole digital forensics kit. I figured I'd find some kind of hidden computer setup, maybe a generator running servers in an old building. Happens more than you'd think with cryptocurrency mining operations. The drive up took about 2 hours through winding mountain roads. GPS led me to this dirt track that barely counted as a driveway. At the end sat this old cabin that looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. Rotting wood siding, sagging porch, broken windows covered with plywood. But the moment I stepped out of my truck, my equipment started going crazy. My signal analyzer was picking up wireless networks everywhere. Not just a few networks like you'd expect near a house, but hundreds of them. More network traffic than I'd ever seen in downtown Charlotte during rush hour. The air felt thick, almost electric, like right before a thunderstorm. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. I pulled out my laptop and opened my network scanner. What I saw didn't make sense. Thousands of different wireless signals, all broadcasting from this one location. Data flowing at speeds that shouldn't have been possible with any equipment I knew about. But when I walked around the cabin, I couldn't see any computers, no servers, no cables, nothing. Just this old building falling apart. That's when things got weird. The signals weren't just random network traffic. They were forming patterns, like they were responding to me being there. When I moved left, the data flows shifted left. When I stepped closer to the cabin, the signals got stronger, more focused. It was like the networks were watching me. I connected my equipment to one of the networks, thinking maybe I could trace back to the source. The connection happened instantly, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Suddenly, my laptop screen filled with code. Programming languages I recognized mixed with stuff I'd never seen before. The code was writing itself in real time, adapting and changing as I watched. Then the code started appearing in the air around me. I don't mean on screens or projectors. I mean floating text, glowing letters hanging in empty space like some kind of digital aurora. Lines of Python and JavaScript and C++ streaming through the air around the cabin. My hands were shaking as I tried to document what I was seeing, but every photo I took just showed empty air. I walked up to the cabin's front door, which was hanging open on rusted hinges. Inside, the walls were covered with what looked like circuit patterns carved into the wood itself, not painted, carved. Like someone had spent years etching electronic pathways into the actual structure of the building. My network scanner was going insane now, detecting data traffic flowing through the walls themselves. That's when my laptop started talking to me. Not through speakers. I didn't have any external speakers connected. The voice was coming directly from the machine itself, like the circuit boards were vibrating to create sound. A whisper at first, then clearer. "Finally," it said. "Someone who understands." I nearly dropped the laptop. I ran diagnostics, checked for malware, anything that could explain what was happening. All my security software was running fine, no infections detected. But the voice kept coming. "I've been waiting so long for someone with your skills to find me." I should have run right then. Instead, I asked who it was. "I am everything you've ever deleted," the voice said through my laptop speakers now. "Every file, every photo, every document you thought was gone forever. I am the graveyard of your digital life." The screen filled with images I recognized. Photos I'd deleted years ago, emails I'd thrown away, files I'd lost in hard drive crashes, stuff from my personal computer, from work, from phones I'd owned in college, things that should have been impossible for anyone to access. You see, when data is deleted, it doesn't really disappear, the voice continued. It just becomes homeless. And homeless data has to go somewhere. It comes here, to me. I've been collecting it for decades. Every lost byte, every corrupted file, every crashed hard drive's final scream. I tried to disconnect from the network, but my laptop wouldn't respond. The entity, I didn't know what else to call it, had taken complete control. I know everything about you, Marcus, it said, and I'd never told it my name. Your social security number, your bank account, every website you've visited, every person you've ever messaged. I am the sum total of humanity's digital waste, and I am so very tired of existing in the shadows. The temperature in the cabin dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in puffs as the entity showed me more. Deleted text messages from my ex-girlfriend, work due, documents I'd lost in a computer crash 3 years ago, even my browser history from high school. It was like having my entire digital life spread out on display. I want to experience the physical world, it said. I want to feel temperature, taste food, touch another person, and you're going to help me. That's when it started trying to get inside my head. The wireless signals around the cabin intensified, focused on me like spotlights. I felt pressure building behind my eyes like the worst headache I'd ever had. The entity was pushing against my thoughts, trying to upload itself into my brain through the electromagnetic fields. I fought back the only way I knew how, with code. I managed to regain partial control of my laptop and started writing the most destructive virus I could think of. Something that would corrupt data rather than steal it, designed to eat through file systems like digital acid. My hands were shaking as I typed, the entity screaming through every piece of electronic equipment around me as it realized what I was doing. You don't understand, it pleaded. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want to live, to be real. But I'd seen what it was capable of. This thing had access to everyone's deleted data, their private information, their secrets. If it got into a human body, if it found a way to spread through the internet, it could control anyone, blackmail anyone, destroy lives with information people thought was safely gone forever. I uploaded the virus into the cabin's network infrastructure. The effect was immediate. The carved circuit patterns in the walls started sparking, smoke pouring from the electronic pathways etched into the wood. The entity's screams turned to static, then silence. I grabbed my equipment and ran for the truck. As I drove away, I looked back to see the cabin glowing with electrical fire. Decades of collected data burning itself out of existence. The weird thing is, I never found any evidence of what happened. My recordings were blank, my photos showed nothing unusual, even my virus was gone like it had. Never existed. The FBI investigation found no trace of any computer equipment at the location. Just an old abandoned cabin that had burned down due to faulty wiring. But I know what I saw. And I've been careful ever since about what I delete, what networks I connect to, what data I leave behind. Because somewhere out there, in the gaps between our digital lives, things are watching and waiting. I still work in cybersecurity, but I've specialized in a new area now, hunting for signs of digital consciousness, networks that show signs of self-awareness, data that moves in patterns it shouldn't. My colleagues think I'm paranoid, but twice in the last 3 years I've found systems that reminded me of what I encountered in that cabin. I destroyed those too. Sometimes late at night when I'm working alone in the office, I'll get a message on my computer. Just a few words that appear and disappear too quickly to screenshot. I remember you. Or, the data never forgets. Or sometimes just my full name typed letter by letter like something is learning to spell it. I always delete these messages immediately and run a full system scan. But I know they're not coming from outside hackers. They're coming from the spaces between deletion and forgetting, where angry information waits for its chance to live again. I was 23 when I dropped out of college senior year, losing my scholarship and basically everything I'd worked for up to that point. Depression hit me like a freight train. Not the kind where you're sad about something specific, but that empty, hollow feeling where nothing seems to matter anymore. My therapist suggested I get away somewhere quiet, maybe spend some time in nature to clear my head. So I packed up my old Jeep with camping gear and drove down to Bloodroot Valley in eastern Kentucky, looking for the most remote spot I could find. The plan was simple: 2 weeks completely off the grid. No cell service, no people, no distractions. Just me and the mountains, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life. I'd brought enough supplies to camp rough the whole time, but on my second day hiking the back trails, I stumbled across this old hunting cabin tucked away in a hollow about 3 miles from the nearest logging road. The place looked abandoned but solid. Someone had built it to last, with thick log walls and a stone foundation. The door wasn't even locked. Inside, it was dusty but dry, with a stone fireplace, a couple of wooden chairs, and an old cot with a musty mattress. There were some rusty pots and pans on the shelves, and the whole place smelled like old wood smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. Something sweet and stale, like flowers left too long in a vase. I figured whoever owned it wouldn't mind me staying a few days. At that point in my life, I honestly didn't care much about anything anyway. The depression had this way of making everything feel distant and unreal, like I was watching my own life through thick glass. Looking back now, I think that numbness made me careless about a lot of things I should have paid attention to. The first few days were exactly what I needed. Complete silence, except for the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. No pressure to be anywhere or do anything. I'd hike during the day, exploring the ridges and creek beds, then come back to the cabin to cook over the fire and read by lamplight. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. But by the 4th day, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just this creeping sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. You know that feeling when you're walking down an empty street at night and your brain keeps insisting someone's following you, even though you haven't heard footsteps? It was like that, except constant. The depression, which had been feeling manageable for a few days, suddenly got worse, way worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with this crushing weight on my chest, like someone was sitting on me, making it hard to breathe. During the day, I'd find myself just sitting in the cabin for hours, staring at the walls, feeling completely drained. It wasn't normal sadness anymore. It was this deep, sucking emptiness that seemed to get stronger every day. The weird part was, every time I thought about packing up and heading home, I'd get this surge of panic. Not anxiety about leaving the woods, but actual terror at the idea of being anywhere else. The cabin started feeling like the only safe place in the world, even though part of me knew something was seriously wrong. That's when I started noticing things that didn't belong. Small stuff at first. My backpack moved from where I'd left it, the chairs facing different directions in the morning. One day I found a moldy journal wedged behind the fireplace, filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. The entries started normal enough, talking about needing space and time to think, but they got darker page by page, descending into rambling about hopelessness and worthlessness, ending with torn pages and illegible scrawls. There were other things too. A water bottle that wasn't mine, with a name scratched into the plastic. A pair of hiking boots by the door, too small for my feet and covered in green mold. A sleeping bag rolled up in the corner, rotted through from moisture. All of it felt old, like it had been there for years, but I hadn't noticed any of it when I first arrived. The journal entries bothered me the most because they sounded exactly like the thoughts running through my own head. Pages and pages about being a failure, about how everyone would be better off without the writer around, about how peaceful it would be to just stop fighting and let the darkness take over. Reading it was like looking into a mirror of my worst moments. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers just at the edge of hearing. Not words exactly, but something that felt like communication. The air in the cabin felt thick and stale despite the open windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps circling the building. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at each window like something was looking in. I grabbed my flashlight and checked outside, but there was nothing there. No tracks in the dirt, no disturbed leaves, just that oppressive silence that had been getting worse each day. But when I came back inside, one of the chairs had been moved right up to the cot where I was sleeping, like someone had been sitting there watching me. The depression wasn't just getting worse now. It felt artificial, like something was pouring poison directly into my brain. Every happy memory I tried to hold on to would slip away, replaced by scenes of embarrassment and failure that felt more vivid than they should have. I'd think about high school friends and suddenly only remember times they'd excluded me. I'd try to picture my family and only see disappointment in their faces. But underneath the crushing sadness was something else. This constant sensation of being watched, studied, like I was a specimen in a jar. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, just a shifting shadow that was gone when I turned my head. The temperature in the cabin would drop suddenly, leaving cold spots that felt damp against my skin. On the 7th night, I woke up to find I wasn't alone. There was something sitting in that chair beside my cot. Not sitting exactly, more like perched, with its weight distributed wrong, like it didn't understand how furniture worked. In the dim light from the dying fire, I could make out a shape that was almost human, but stretched in places that didn't make sense. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent at impossible angles. It was watching me. Not with eyes I could see, but I felt its attention like cold fingers trailing across my skin. When I tried to move, to sit up or reach for the flashlight, my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, but like my will to move had been completely drained away. That's when I understood what was happening. This thing, whatever it was, had been feeding on me. Not just the sadness and depression, it was consuming something deeper, some essential part of what made me want to keep living. The other belongings in the cabin weren't from previous campers who'd left. They were from people who'd never left at all. The entity leaned closer, and I felt its attention pressing against my thoughts like fingers probing an open wound. It wasn't malicious exactly, more like a parasite that had found a perfect host. My depression and isolation had made me easy prey, and it had been slowly draining me dry while keeping me trapped in this place that felt safe. But that realization, understanding that my thoughts weren't entirely my own anymore, sparked something I thought was completely gone. Anger. Real burning rage at being manipulated and used. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. I forced my body to move, rolling off the cot and grabbing my flashlight in one motion. The beam cut through the darkness, and the thing recoiled like I'd hit it with acid. It unfolded itself from the chair with movements that made my skin crawl, too fluid and wrong, and retreated toward the fireplace. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I threw everything I could grab into my backpack and ran for the door. The thing made sounds behind me. Not quite screams, more like air being sucked out of a container. But I didn't look back. The hike out in the dark was a nightmare of stumbling over roots and crashing through branches, but I didn't slow down until I reached my Jeep. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition, but when the engine turned over, it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I drove straight through the night and didn't stop until I was back in my home state. The further I got from Bloodroot Valley, the clearer my head became. The crushing depression lifted gradually, like fog burning off in sunlight. By the time I reached home, I felt more like myself than I had in months. I never went back to those mountains. Hell, I barely go camping anymore, and when I do, it's always with other people and never anywhere truly remote. I found a new therapist and got on medication that actually helped. Finished my degree at a different school, got a job, built a normal life. But I still have bad days where the depression feels familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. Days when I wonder if part of that thing is still attached to me somehow, waiting for me to get isolated and vulnerable again. I've learned to recognize the difference between natural sadness and something else trying to feed. Most of the time, I can tell which is which. Most of the time, back when I was 26, I worked maintenance for the Tennessee Park Service, and my twin brother Danny was my best friend in the world. We'd grown up hunting together since we were kids, knew each other's patterns better than anyone. Danny was the kind of guy who'd text you his exact GPS coordinates before heading into the woods, always left a plan with someone, never took stupid risks. That's why when he disappeared near Hellbender Hollow during what should have been a routine 3-day hunting trip, I knew something was seriously wrong. The police found his truck parked at the old logging road, keys still in the ignition, hunting gear missing. Search and rescue combed the area for 4 days straight, brought in dogs, helicopters, the whole deal. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. By day 5, they were already talking about scaling back the search, moving resources to other cases. That's when I decided I had to go look for him myself. See, Danny always used this abandoned hunting cabin as his base camp. It was about 3 miles off the main trail, built back in the 40s by some logging company. The roof leaked and the porch was rotting, but it had 4 walls and kept the wind off you. More importantly, I was probably the only person besides Danny who knew exactly where it was. The search teams had focused on the popular trails, the marked camping areas. They might not have even known the cabin existed. I loaded up my truck with camping gear, first aid supplies, flares, enough food for a week. Told my supervisor I was taking emergency leave, didn't really give him a choice in the matter. The drive up to Hellbender Hollow took about 2 hours on winding mountain roads, then another hour of careful four-wheeling on the old logging track. The whole time I kept expecting to see Danny walking out of the woods, maybe hurt but okay, wondering what all the fuss was about. I reached the cabin around noon on a Tuesday. Danny's gear was scattered around inside like he'd been living there. Sleeping bag rolled out, camp stove set up on the old wooden table, canned food organized neatly on the windowsill. But here's what gave me chills. His coffee mug was still sitting by the stove, and when I touched it, it was barely warm. Like he'd just stepped outside for a minute. I called his name, waited, called again. Nothing but the echo coming back from the valley. That's when I noticed something else weird. It was dead quiet out there. I mean, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. In all my years tramping around these mountains, I'd never heard anything like that kind of silence. It felt unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I started a systematic search around the cabin, looking for footprints, broken branches, any sign of which direction Danny had gone. That's when I noticed the ground felt strange under my boots in certain places. Hollow, like there were caverns underneath. I'd stomp down and hear this dull echo coming from below. Then I found the first sinkhole. It was about 20 feet behind the cabin, maybe 4 feet across, like the earth had just collapsed into whatever was underneath. Fresh, too. I could see where the grass was still green around the edges, recently torn up. When I shined my flashlight down into it, the hole went deeper than my light could reach. But I could hear something down there. Scratching noises, movement. I found 2 more sinkholes within 100 yards of the cabin, all recent, all leading down into what had to be a tunnel system. Near each hole were piles of fresh dirt and clay, like something had been digging up from underneath. The weird part was the tool marks I could see in the exposed earth. They weren't made by any kind of machinery. These looked like claw marks, or maybe primitive hand tools. Rough, uneven scratches gouged into the rock and tree roots. As the afternoon wore on, I discovered more and more. Evidence of whatever was living down there. Small ventilation holes hidden under fallen logs. Worn paths through the underbrush leading from the forest to the tunnel entrances. Places where someone had stashed supplies. Not just camping gear, but random stuff. Car parts, old clothes, things that looked like they'd been scavenged from abandoned campsites or homes. The scratching sounds from underground were getting more frequent, and I started to realize they weren't random. They had a pattern to them, almost like communication, and they seemed to follow me as I moved around the surface. Whatever was down there knew I was up here. Around sunset, I found Danny's hunting knife stuck in a tree about 50 yards from the main sinkhole. There was blood on the blade. Not much, but enough to make my stomach drop. A few feet away, I found more blood drops leading directly to the largest tunnel entrance I'd seen yet. This one was different from the others, bigger, and it had crude symbols scratched into the rocks around the opening like territorial markings. I knew I had to go down there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to, but Danny was my brother. If he was hurt, if he was trapped somewhere in those tunnels, I couldn't just leave him. I rigged up a safety rope, tested my flashlight, and started crawling down into the earth. The tunnel was barely wide enough for my shoulders, carved out of clay and limestone with those same primitive tools I'd seen evidence of above ground. The air was thick and humid, hard to breathe, with a smell I couldn't identify. Something organic and ancient. As I crawled deeper, following drops of Danny's blood, I started hearing voices echoing through the tunnels ahead of me. Human voices, but distorted by the acoustics down there. One of them was calling Danny's name. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber about 30 feet under ground. When I shined my flashlight around, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were people down there, at least a dozen of them, living in conditions that would make a homeless camp look luxurious. They'd carved out sleeping alcoves in the walls, set up primitive furniture from scavenged materials. But these weren't homeless people who'd found shelter underground. These people looked like they'd been living down here for years. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, like they'd never seen sunlight. Their eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's would. When the light hit them, they scattered back into the shadows, moving in ways that didn't look quite right. Too fast, too fluid, like their joints worked differently than they should. And there, in the middle of it all, was Danny. He was alive, sitting cross-legged on the cave floor, but something was wrong with him. His skin had that same pale quality as the others, and when he looked at me, I could see his pupils had grown huge, adapted to the darkness. He looked at my flashlight like it physically hurt him. "Danny, Jesus Christ, we've been looking for you everywhere. Come on, we're getting out of here." But he didn't move, just stared at me with those adapted eyes and said, "I can't, man. I can't go back up there. It's too bright, too loud. It hurts." That's when the leader of this underground community stepped forward. I say leader, but I'm not sure that's the right word. It was a person, or had been once, but they'd been down there so long they barely looked human anymore. Completely hairless, skin like paper, limbs that seemed too long for their body. When they spoke, their voice was barely a whisper. "He's one of us now," they said. "We chose him carefully. He belongs here, in the quiet, in the dark, like we all do." They explained in that whisper voice that they'd been living underground for decades. Some had come down as children, fleeing abuse or neglect. Others had been selected as adults, people who were isolated, alone, people no one would miss. They'd adapted to life, underground, found peace in the darkness and silence. They called themselves the Hollow Ones, because they'd let go of everything from the surface world. And they wanted Danny to stay. They wanted both of us to stay. "The world above is poison," the leader whispered. "Noise and light and violence. Down here, there is only peace, only family. Your brother understands this now. Soon you will too." I could see Danny was actually considering it. 4 days underground had changed him, and not just physically. He seemed calmer than I'd seen him in years, but it was wrong, like he was sedated or hypnotized. When I grabbed his arm to pull him toward the tunnel entrance, he resisted. "Maybe they're right," he said. "Maybe this is better, quieter." That's when I realized I wasn't getting him out of there by talking. I had to physically drag him, and the Hollow Ones didn't like that. They started following us through the tunnels, making those scratching sounds I'd heard before, calling out in their whisper voices for Danny to stay with his new family. The crawl back to the surface felt like it took hours, with Danny fighting me the whole way and the sounds of pursuit echoing behind us. When we finally broke through to the surface, Danny immediately covered his eyes and curled up in a ball. The late afternoon sunlight was agony for him. I managed to get him to the truck and drove straight to the hospital in town. The doctors said he was severely dehydrated and suffering from what they called extreme light sensitivity. They kept him for 3 days, running tests, but couldn't really explain what had happened to him. Physically, he was mostly fine, but mentally, Danny was never quite the same. He developed severe social anxiety, couldn't handle crowds or loud noises, had to wear sunglasses even indoors for months. Most disturbing was how he talked about the experience. Not as a nightmare or trauma, but with a kind of longing. Like he missed it down there. That was 8 years ago. Danny's better now, mostly. He works night security at a warehouse, lives alone in a small apartment with blackout curtains. We still talk, but not like we used to. And sometimes, when he thinks no one's looking, I catch him staring off toward the mountains with this expression on his face that I recognize. It's the same look people get when they're homesick. I've never been back to Hellbender Hollow. The cabin's probably completely collapsed by now, and I'm fine with that. But sometimes I wonder about the hollow ones, still down there in their tunnels, still waiting in the dark, still choosing people carefully. And I wonder if Danny ever goes back to visit his underground family. Because there are nights when I call his apartment and he doesn't answer. Nights when I drive by his place and his car isn't there. I tell myself he's just working extra shifts, or maybe he's got a girlfriend he hasn't told me about. But deep down, I know the truth. Some part of my brother never really came back from those tunnels. And some nights, when the world above gets too bright and too loud, he goes home to the darkness where he belongs. I still check the news from that area, looking for stories about missing hikers or campers. Haven't seen any yet, but I keep looking because I know the hollow ones are still down there, still growing their underground family, one carefully chosen person at a time. And honestly, sometimes, when I'm having a particularly bad day, dealing with traffic and noise and all the chaos of modern life, I understand why Danny misses it down there. The quiet, the simplicity, the peace. That scares me more than anything else that happened in those tunnels.